The smallest act of kindness can become the biggest turning point in a life you never knew existed. Rain fell over downtown Chicago in relentless silver sheets, turning every streetlight into a blurred halo and every passing car into a ghost of reflected headlights. Most people hurried beneath umbrellas, keeping their eyes low and their phones safely tucked away, eager to reach warm apartments before the storm grew worse. Harper Collins did not have that luxury. Her shift at the neighborhood bookstore had ended nearly an hour late after a delivery truck arrived behind schedule, and now she stood beneath the narrow awning of a closed bakery, hugging her thin jacket against the cold while waiting for the city bus that never seemed to arrive on rainy nights. The digital sign at the stop flickered twice before going completely dark, another casualty of the weather. She sighed quietly, brushed damp strands of blonde hair behind her ear and checked the battery on her phone. 8% remained. Enough, she hoped, to let her roommate know she would be home late. A loud crack of thunder rolled across the skyline, followed by another wave of rain that seemed even heavier than before. Across the street, traffic slowed to a crawl. Horns echoed through the wet evening as windshield wipers struggled to keep pace with the storm. That was when she noticed him. He stood alone near the entrance of a small convenience store, whose windows were suddenly black after the neighborhood lost power. He wasn't pacing or waving for help. He simply looked around with calm, measured movements that somehow made the chaos feel quieter. His charcoal overcoat was soaked from the shoulders down, dark hair damp against his forehead, yet nothing about him suggested panic. If anything, everyone else looked unsettled while he remained perfectly still. Harper almost looked away until she noticed him speaking briefly with the elderly cashier inside the dark store. The old man shook his head apologetically. No electricity meant no working phone. The stranger thanked him with a polite nod before stepping back into the rain. He glanced toward the silent traffic, then toward the dead payphone on the corner that looked as though it hadn't worked in years. Finally, his eyes landed on the small group waiting beneath the bus shelter. Most people immediately avoided eye contact. Harper watched as he approached with steady, respectful steps, asking one commuter after another the same simple question. Each person declined before he had even finished speaking. Some shook their heads, others tightened their grip on their phones and turned away. The stranger never argued. He simply thanked them and moved on. By the time he reached Harper, only the rain could be heard between them. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice calm and surprisingly warm. "My phone died during the storm. I only need 30 seconds to call my driver." She studied him for a moment. His clothes were expensive without being flashy. His watch caught the glow of a nearby traffic light before disappearing beneath his sleeve. More than anything, it was his expression that held her attention. He wasn't demanding help. He wasn't trying to charm her. He looked tired, like someone carrying responsibilities too heavy for one evening. Harper glanced at her battery again. 7% now. She hesitated just long enough to hear her mother's voice somewhere in memory, reminding her that kindness always involved a little risk. 30 seconds, she said softly, unlocking the screen. "That's all I've got left." Gratitude crossed his face almost invisibly before he accepted the phone with careful hands, as though it belonged to someone far more important than himself. He dialed a number from memory instead of searching through contacts. "It's me," he said after the call connected. "The battery died. Pick me up at the corner of Madison and Clark." He listened for only a few seconds before ending the call and immediately handed the phone back. "Thank you," he said. "You probably saved someone an hour of worrying." Harper smiled faintly. "I hope whoever's coming brings an umbrella." For the first time, he smiled too. It wasn't dramatic or practiced, just brief enough to transform the sharp lines of his face into something unexpectedly human. "They'll bring more than that," he replied. Before she could answer, several black SUVs turned slowly onto the rain-soaked street, with headlights glowing through the storm. They stopped with quiet precision along the curb. Men in dark suits stepped out holding umbrellas, but none of them moved until the stranger gave the smallest nod. Harper blinked, suddenly aware that everyone beneath the bus shelter had stopped pretending not to watch. The stranger accepted the umbrella offered to him, then looked back toward her one final time. "One day," he said with quiet sincerity, "I hope I have the chance to return your kindness." Before she could tell him it wasn't necessary, he disappeared into the waiting vehicle. Within seconds, the convoy melted into the rain as though it had never been there at all. Harper looked down at her phone. The battery had fallen to 5%. She slipped it into her pocket, convinced she would never see the mysterious stranger again. Unfortunately for her, less than 2 miles away, A man seated in the back of the lead SUV quietly instructed his security chief to find the name of the woman who had trusted a complete stranger on the darkest night of the season. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale grey clouds that never quite surrendered to sunlight. Chicago looked washed clean after the storm, but the sidewalks still shimmered with puddles that reflected passing trains and impatient commuters. HarperCollins unlocked the front door of the independent bookstore 15 minutes before opening, breathing in the familiar scent of paper, cedar shelves, and fresh coffee drifting from the cafe next door. It was the kind of place where people came to slow down, where conversations stayed quiet and time seemed to move differently than it did outside. She preferred it that way. The memory of the mysterious stranger had already begun to feel unreal, like one of those chance encounters people exaggerated years later. She laughed softly at herself while organizing a display of new releases. There was no reason to think about him anymore. He had his world, she had hers. Somewhere across the city, however, a black sedan rolled through the underground entrance of a glass office tower where every employee straightened the moment the vehicle appeared. The man from the storm stepped out without ceremony, acknowledging greetings with brief nods before disappearing into a private elevator. Few people knew how little sleep he had managed after returning home. Fewer still knew that instead of reviewing financial reports first thing that morning, he had asked only one question. Had they identified the woman who lent him her phone? His security chief had quietly placed a slim folder on the polished conference table. HarperCollins, 26 years old, works at a neighborhood bookstore. Volunteers twice a month at a literacy program for children. No criminal record, no unusual financial activity, no social media obsession with wealthy public figures. An ordinary life. The man closed the folder after reading only the first page. "Do nothing," he said calmly. "She helped someone expecting nothing in return. It stays that way." The security chief nodded, although the instructions surprised him. They were accustomed to solving problems, not leaving loose threads untouched. Meanwhile, Harper spent her afternoon recommending novels to retired teachers, helping a college student find a used history textbook, and laughing with an elderly regular who insisted mystery novels had become too predictable. The rhythm of normal life slowly erased the lingering curiosity she had carried since the storm. By late afternoon, she volunteered at the community literacy center 3 blocks away, where children from working families gathered after school. She listened patiently while an 8-year-old struggled through a difficult chapter before celebrating every correctly pronounced sentence as though it deserved its own trophy. Kindness had always come naturally to her. She never considered it remarkable. On her walk home, she stopped at a neighborhood grocery store for milk, pasta, and coffee. As she waited in line, she noticed an elderly woman searching every pocket of her purse with growing embarrassment. Her credit card had been declined, and she quietly asked the cashier to remove several items. Harper stepped forward before thinking twice. "Please let me cover the difference," she said with an apologetic smile, as though she were the one asking for a favor. The woman protested only once before tears welled in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You remind me of my daughter." Harper simply wished her a good evening and carried her own groceries into the cooling autumn air. She never noticed the dark SUV parked half a block away. Inside, 2 men watched without speaking. One made a brief phone call. "She did it again," he said. Silence answered for several seconds before a calm voice replied, "I expected she would." Back at her apartment, Harper found her roommate Olivia cooking soup while complaining about rising rent and unreliable buses. They laughed over burnt toast and watched the evening news, which briefly mentioned an anonymous business leader donating millions to rebuild neighborhood libraries damaged by recent storms. No photograph accompanied the report. No name appeared on the screen. Harper barely looked up from folding laundry. Across the city, the same report played silently inside an expansive office where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline glowing beneath another gathering layer of clouds. The man watched the broadcast without expression before turning it off. His attention drifted toward the rain beginning once again against the glass. Most people forgot strangers within hours. Some remembered for a lifetime. He belonged to the second kind. Unfortunately for Harper, she still believed the previous night had been nothing more than an ordinary act of kindness, completely unaware that someone with extraordinary influence had quietly decided that if life ever placed her in genuine need, she would never have to face it alone. Saturday mornings always brought a different rhythm to the bookstore. Parents wandered slowly between colorful shelves while children disappeared into corners filled with picture books and impossible adventures. HarperCollins enjoyed those hours more than any others. The world felt softer before noon, as though people remembered how to be patient. She arranged a stack of newly arrived novels near the front window, while golden autumn sunlight replaced the rain that had dominated the previous week. Outside, the neighborhood breathed with ordinary life. Cyclists passed carrying paper bags from the farmer's market. A musician played quiet jazz beneath the train tracks. Someone laughed across the street. Nothing hinted that invisible threads had already begun connecting two lives that were never supposed to cross again. Less than 5 miles away, a private conference unfolded behind the mirrored walls of an executive office overlooking the city. Men discussed contracts, investments, shipping schedules, and expansion plans with practiced precision. The man seated at the head of the table listened more than he spoke. Every decision arrived with calm certainty, every instruction measured and brief. When the meeting finally ended, one executive casually mentioned the Literacy Foundation that had requested another anonymous donation before the end of the month. The room waited for an answer. He looked through the window toward the sprawling skyline before replying, "Approve it. Double the amount." No explanation followed. None was expected. By early afternoon, Harper locked the bookstore for her lunch break and walked toward the small community center where she volunteered every other weekend. The center hosted a neighborhood reading program, and today's event included families displaced after several apartment buildings suffered flood damage during the recent storms. Children laughed while decorating bookmarks with bright markers and glitter. Parents exchanged quiet conversations over donated coffee. Harper moved naturally from table to table, helping nervous readers sound out difficult words, celebrating every small success with genuine enthusiasm. Near the entrance, a little boy stood alone, staring at the crowded room. He looked no older than 7. His backpack hung from one shoulder and uncertainty filled his eyes. Harper knelt until they were at eye level. "First time here?" she asked gently. He nodded without speaking. "Would you like to help me hand out these books? It is the most important job in the room." His expression brightened almost immediately. Together they carried stacks of books from table to table until his nervous silence disappeared beneath excited conversations with the other children. Harper never realized someone had quietly photographed the event for the community newsletter. The image captured nothing extraordinary. A young woman smiling beside a child while holding a stack of books. Ordinary kindness, frozen inside an ordinary afternoon. Yet later that evening, the photograph found its way across several desks before arriving inside a private office. The man studied it for several silent seconds. There was no staged charity event, no television cameras, no wealthy donors shaking hands for publicity. She had no audience to impress. She simply chose kindness whenever the opportunity appeared. His security chief noticed the unusual length of the silence. "Would you like us to continue monitoring?" he asked carefully. The answer came almost immediately. "Only to ensure she remains safe, nothing more." The older man hesitated. "Exactly," came the quiet reply. As the sun began setting over Chicago, Harper left the community center carrying an empty donation box toward her apartment. The streets glowed amber beneath the fading light. She stopped at a crosswalk where traffic had backed up for nearly a block because of road construction. An impatient driver leaned on his horn while an elderly crossing guard struggled to guide children safely across the intersection. Without hesitation, Harper set down the box and stepped beside the crossing guard, helping organize the crowd until every child reached the opposite sidewalk. It delayed her walk home by only a few minutes, but it allowed the exhausted volunteer to sit down and catch his breath. "You have a habit of appearing exactly when people need help," the old man said with a grateful smile. Harper laughed softly. "I just happened to be walking by." She picked up the empty box and continued home before he could thank her again. What she did not know was that another pair of observant eyes had witnessed the entire moment from inside a parked sedan waiting for traffic to clear. A brief message was sent. She helped a stranger again. The response arrived almost instantly. "I know." There was no surprise in those words anymore, only quiet certainty. That night, Harper opened her apartment mailbox and discovered a plain white envelope without a return address. There was no letter inside. Only a brand new library card for the city's largest public research library, already activated in her name with a small handwritten note tucked behind it. "Every story deserves another chapter." No signature, no explanation. Harper frowned with quiet confusion, unable to imagine who could have sent such an unusual gift. Across the city, a man stood alone beside floor-to-ceiling windows as darkness settled over Chicago. Far below, thousands of strangers hurried through lives that would never intersect with his own. Yet somehow the woman who had offered 30 seconds of trust beneath a storm had become the one person he could not stop remembering. Unfortunately for Harper, curiosity had just entered the story. And curiosity had a way of opening doors that kindness alone never could. Monday arrived wrapped in crisp autumn air, the kind that carried the scent of roasted coffee, fallen leaves, and the promise of another ordinary week. Harper Collins slipped the mysterious library card into her wallet before leaving for work, still unable to decide whether it had been delivered by mistake or sent by someone she had unknowingly helped. The handwritten note lingered in her thoughts throughout the morning. Every story deserves another chapter. The words felt strangely personal, despite the absence of a signature. She told herself not to overthink it. Life was already full of coincidences that never meant anything. The bookstore remained unusually busy as tourists wandered inside, searching for local history books while students prepared for midterm exams. Harper recommended novels, carried heavy boxes from the stockroom, and smiled through conversations that blended together until early afternoon when the owner approached holding an elegant cream-colored envelope. "This came for you," he said. "Couriers dropped it off about an hour ago." Harper frowned. Nobody ever sent her handwritten mail. She carefully opened the envelope and discovered an invitation from the Chicago Public Library Foundation. A private appreciation dinner would recognize volunteers who had quietly served local literacy programs throughout the year. Transportation would be provided, formal attire requested, guest list by invitation only. Harper immediately assumed there had been some administrative mistake. She had volunteered because she enjoyed helping children read, not because she expected recognition. "You should go," the bookstore owner said after reading the invitation over her shoulder. "People like you never think they deserve invitations like this. That is exactly why you do." She smiled politely but remained uncertain. Across the city, preparations for the same evening unfolded inside one of Chicago's oldest historic hotels. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across polished marble floors, while staff adjusted floral arrangements and tested microphones before the first guests arrived. Everything appeared effortless because dozens of people had spent the entire day ensuring it would. Less than an hour before the reception began, the man Harper remembered only as the stranger from the storm entered through a private entrance accompanied by several associates. Conversations paused almost imperceptibly as employees acknowledged him with respectful nods. He accepted a folder from his assistant containing the evening schedule but closed it without reading further. "Has she accepted the invitation?" he asked quietly. "Yes," the assistant replied. "She confirmed this morning." For reasons even he struggled to explain, that answer seemed to ease something invisible across his expression. Meanwhile, Harper stood inside her apartment staring at the only formal dress she owned, a simple navy dress purchased years earlier for a friend's wedding. Olivia helped smooth the fabric before stepping back with an approving smile. "You always underestimate yourself," she said. "Maybe tonight someone else finally notices what everyone around you already knows." Harper laughed awkwardly. "It is just a volunteer dinner." "Maybe," Olivia replied, "or maybe life surprises people who stop expecting it." Twilight settled across Chicago as Harper arrived at the historic hotel, momentarily overwhelmed by towering columns, polished brass doors, and soft piano music drifting through the grand lobby. Guests greeted one another with practiced elegance while photographers documented the evening for local newspapers. Harper quietly checked her invitation, hoping to find a seat somewhere unnoticed. She preferred helping behind the scenes to standing beneath chandeliers. What she did not know was that someone had already noticed her arrival the moment she stepped through the revolving doors. From the balcony overlooking the ballroom, calm eyes followed the young woman whose quiet kindness had somehow remained unforgettable long after the rain had ended. He did not approach. He simply watched as she accepted a name badge from the event coordinator, thanked every employee she encountered, and instinctively stopped to help another guest retrieve a folder that had slipped onto the marble floor. Small gestures, barely noticeable to anyone else, impossible for him to ignore. Harper entered the ballroom moments later and found her assigned table near the back. Relieved she would remain far from the stage, the room slowly filled with teachers, librarians, volunteers, donors, and community leaders whose conversations blended into a gentle hum beneath the music. She reached for the water glass waiting at her place setting when the master of ceremonies welcomed everyone and invited the foundation's principal benefactor to offer the opening remarks. Applause echoed across the ballroom as a familiar figure stepped onto the stage beneath warm amber lights. Harper looked up absent-mindedly at first, then froze as recognition swept across her face. The man from the storm stood only 50 feet away, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, carrying himself with the same quiet confidence she remembered from that impossible night. He paused for the briefest moment as his eyes found hers across the crowded ballroom. Nobody else seemed to notice the silent exchange. Unfortunately for Harper, she had just discovered that the stranger she believed she would never meet again belonged to a world far larger, far more influential, and far closer than she had ever imagined. Harper could not explain why her heartbeat suddenly felt louder than the applause filling the ballroom. The man standing beneath the warm lights was unmistakably the stranger from the storm, yet everything about him seemed different tonight. The quiet traveler who had politely borrowed her phone now carried the effortless confidence of someone every guest recognized before he even spoke. Conversations faded naturally around him. Executives, educators, elected officials, and philanthropists all seemed to wait for his first words. Harper lowered her eyes toward the program resting beside her plate, searching for the name printed beneath the evening's principal benefactor, Alessandro Romano. The letters meant nothing to her, but judging from the respectful silence surrounding the room, they clearly meant everything to everyone else. Communities are not changed by the wealthiest people, he began, his calm voice carrying easily across the ballroom. They are changed by ordinary people who quietly decide to help someone when nobody is watching. Harper looked up again without meaning to. His eyes swept across hundreds of guests before resting briefly on her side of the room. Perhaps it was coincidence, perhaps not. Libraries, teachers, volunteers, and neighbors build stronger cities one person at a time, he continued. Many of those people will never appear in newspapers. They will never ask for recognition. Yet they leave the deepest mark on someone else's life. The audience responded with warm applause. Harper joined them, although an uncomfortable feeling settled inside her chest. Something about his words felt strangely familiar, almost personal. The ceremony continued with awards presented to educators, librarians, and non-profit leaders. Harper expected nothing more than an enjoyable evening and a quiet ride home. Then the master of ceremonies smiled toward the audience. Before dinner is served, our foundation would also like to recognize several community volunteers whose work rarely receives public attention. Harper glanced back toward the nearest exit, hoping the speeches would end soon. She had absolutely no reason to suspect her own name would be called. Miss Harper Collins. For one long second she remained perfectly still. Several people at her table turned toward her with encouraging smiles before polite applause spread across the ballroom. Harper looked around, convinced there had been another Harper Collins somewhere in the room. The event coordinator gently approached and whispered, "That is you." Heat rushed into her face as she slowly stood, smoothing the front of her dress before making the long walk toward the stage. Every step across the polished floor felt impossibly loud. She accepted a framed certificate with grateful embarrassment, thanking the presenters before preparing to leave as quickly as possible. "One moment," the master of ceremony said with a smile. "Mr. Romano personally requested that our final community recognition be presented by him." Harper stopped. Alessandro stepped forward carrying a small velvet box no larger than a paperback novel. He offered a polite handshake instead of the formal embrace several photographers clearly expected. "It is good to see you again," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Surprise flickered across her expression. "You remembered me?" she asked before she could stop herself. The smallest hint of a smile touched his face. Some kindness is impossible to forget. Camera flashes illuminated the stage as he handed her the velvet box. Inside rested a silver bookmark engraved with a simple quotation. "Kindness travels farther than we ever see. No company logo, no family crest, no expensive gemstones. Just polished silver and carefully chosen words." Harper looked up, genuinely moved. "Thank you," she whispered. "You already thanked me once," Alessandro replied. Tonight simply balances the conversation. Before she could ask what he meant, he stepped aside, allowing the ceremony to continue without drawing further attention to either of them. Back at her table, several guests congratulated her while asking how long she had worked with the literacy program. Harper answered politely, but her thoughts kept returning to the man on stage. He had remembered a 30-second favor from a stranger in the rain. That alone seemed difficult to believe. Across the ballroom, Alessandro resumed conversations with donors and civic leaders as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet every few minutes his attention quietly drifted toward the back of the room where Harper listened attentively to volunteers twice her age, laughing warmly at stories about neighborhood libraries and children's reading clubs. She never tried to impress anyone, she simply listened. As the evening drew toward its conclusion, guests slowly filtered into the grand lobby beneath crystal chandeliers glowing against the dark Chicago sky. Harper thanked the organizers and wrapped her light coat around her shoulders before stepping outside into the cool night air. She reached the sidewalk just as she realized the last bus had already departed. She quietly opened the transportation application on her nearly empty phone, hoping to find another route home. Unfortunately for her, a sleek black sedan rolled silently toward the hotel entrance at that exact moment, and the rear passenger door slowly opened before anyone inside spoke a single word. Harper hesitated on the hotel steps as the cool night breeze carried the distant sound of passing trains through downtown Chicago. The black sedan waited at the curb with quiet patience, its polished surface reflecting rows of glowing streetlights. A uniformed driver stepped forward and spoke with professional courtesy. "Miss Collins, Mr. Romano asked me to make certain you arrived home safely. There is no obligation, only an offer." She instinctively glanced toward the nearly empty bus stop across the street before looking back at the waiting car. Every lesson about accepting rides from strangers echoed inside her mind, yet Alessandro Romano no longer felt like a complete stranger. He had thanked her twice for a simple favor she had almost forgotten. Still, caution won over curiosity. "Please thank him for me," she replied with a gentle smile. "I appreciate the offer, but I can manage." The driver nodded respectfully without showing disappointment. "Very well, Miss Collins. Have a safe evening." He returned to the sedan, closed the rear door, and quietly drove away without another word. Harper released a breath she had not realized she was holding. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet it somehow left her feeling even more uncertain than before. Most powerful people expected gratitude to become obedience. Alessandro had accepted her refusal without hesitation. That detail stayed with her during the long train ride home. Less than 20 minutes later, inside another moving vehicle crossing the river toward the northern part of the city, Alessandro listened silently as his security chief summarized the brief encounter. She declined the ride. Alessandro looked through the rain-speckled window toward the glowing skyline. "She made the correct decision," he answered calmly. "Trust should never be purchased with comfort." The older man nodded slowly. It was not the answer he had expected. The following morning, Harper placed the engraved silver bookmark inside her favorite novel before leaving for work. She had considered returning it, worried it might be too valuable, but the simple inscription convinced her otherwise. "Kindness travels farther than we ever see." Those words felt less like a gift and more like a reminder. Business at the bookstore remained steady throughout the day until shortly after lunch, when a local elementary school teacher hurried inside wearing an expression somewhere between excitement and disbelief. "Harper," she said, still catching her breath, "you have to see this." She unfolded a newspaper featuring a story about a newly announced literacy initiative that would provide thousands of free books, after-school reading programs, and scholarships across several Chicago neighborhoods. The photograph showed smiling children surrounded by shelves of books. Harper recognized the community center almost immediately. "They chose our program," the teacher said. "Everything is fully funded. We thought we would spend another year trying to raise enough money, but now," her voice faded beneath grateful laughter. Harper studied the article carefully. The foundation responsible for the donation remained anonymous except for one sentence near the bottom of the page. The initiative had been coordinated through the Romano Foundation for Educational Opportunity. Her eyes lingered on the name, Romano. She folded the newspaper carefully, remembering the speech from the gala, the quiet handshake, the silver bookmark, and the unexpected ride home. Coincidences were beginning to feel less accidental. That afternoon, she visited the community center after work, where volunteers unpacked hundreds of brand new books still smelling of fresh ink and cardboard. Children raced excitedly between unopened boxes, while teachers wiped away emotional tears they tried unsuccessfully to hide. One elderly librarian gently placed a hand on Harper's shoulder. "Sometimes one generous heart inspires another," she whispered. Harper smiled politely, but uncertainty continued growing beneath the surface. She could not shake the feeling that invisible doors had begun opening around her without her ever reaching for the handle. Across the city, Alessandro concluded another series of meetings before standing alone beside the wide windows of his office. Below him, Evening traffic flowed like rivers of white and red light between steel towers. His assistant entered quietly carrying a folder. "The literacy project has already begun distribution," she reported. "The community response has been overwhelmingly positive." Alessandro accepted the report without opening it. "Good," he replied. "That was always the point." As the assistant turned to leave, she paused. "May I ask something?" He nodded. "You have supported education for years. Why does this particular project seem different?" Alessandro remained silent for several moments before answering. "Because someone reminded me that compassion does not announce itself. It simply appears when it is needed." That evening, Harper walked home beneath another sky filled with gathering clouds. She reached into her bag to retrieve her apartment keys when she noticed a young girl sitting alone outside the building entrance, hugging a backpack almost larger than herself. The child looked frightened, repeatedly glancing up and down the street as daylight slowly disappeared. Harper immediately knelt beside her and spoke with the same calm kindness she offered everyone. She had no way of knowing that before the night ended, that single conversation would pull her closer to Alessandro Romano's hidden world than either of them had ever intended. The little girl clutched the faded purple backpack so tightly that her knuckles turned pale beneath the evening light. Harper sat beside her on the apartment steps without asking questions too quickly. Children trusted silence before they trusted strangers. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked gently. The girl nodded. "My aunt works upstairs," she whispered. "She told me to stay here after school because she got stuck at work." Harper smiled reassuringly. "Then you picked the right place to wait." She stayed with the child, talking about favorite books, school projects, and the cartoon cat stitched onto the backpack until a woman hurried breathlessly around the corner several minutes later. Relief washed across the woman's face as she thanked Harper repeatedly before embracing her niece. Harper simply wished them a safe evening and climbed the stairs to her apartment, never realizing a security camera mounted across the street had quietly recorded the entire interaction. Less than an hour later, the footage played inside a private office where Alessandro Romano stood beside a wide window overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline. His security chief had intended to discuss a completely different matter before mentioning the recording almost as an afterthought. Alessandro watched the brief clip in complete silence. Harper had no audience, no recognition, no reason to remain after confirming the child was safe, yet she had stayed anyway. When the video ended, he looked away from the screen. "Delete the recording," he said calmly. "It served its purpose." The older man hesitated. "You do not wish to keep it?" Alessandro shook his head. "People deserve privacy when they choose kindness." The following morning arrived bright and unusually warm for late October. Harper walked to work carrying a reusable coffee cup, while leaves drifted lazily across the sidewalks. She passed the community center and smiled as children carried new books through the front entrance, still benefiting from the anonymous literacy project. Seeing their excitement made everything else feel wonderfully ordinary again. By lunchtime, the bookstore welcomed a steady stream of customers escaping the cool breeze outside. Shortly after 2 o'clock, the owner approached Harper carrying the store telephone. "Someone specifically asked for you." Harper frowned. Almost nobody called her at work. "Hello?" she answered cautiously. A familiar voice replied almost immediately. "I hope I am not interrupting your day." Harper stopped walking between the bookshelves. "Mr. Romano?" "Alessandro is perfectly acceptable if you are comfortable with it," she smiled despite herself. "I was not expecting your call." "Neither was I," he admitted with quiet honesty. "I wanted to thank you once again." Harper laughed softly. "You have thanked me more times than anyone should for 30 seconds and one phone call." A brief silence followed before he answered, perhaps because it was never about the phone. She leaned lightly against the nearest shelf. "Then what was it about?" Another pause. Longer this time. "It reminded me that generosity still exists without conditions." His answer caught her completely off guard. Before she could think of an appropriate response, he continued, "The Literacy Center received its first shipment yesterday. I thought you would like to know." Harper looked toward the front window spilled across rows of novels. "You knew I volunteered there?" "Yes. How?" There was no hesitation in his reply. "After that night in the rain, I asked who had trusted a complete stranger when everyone else walked away. I learned about your volunteer work because I wanted to understand the person I intended to thank properly. Nothing more." Harper absorbed his explanation quietly. It should have unsettled her. Instead, his honesty removed much of the uncertainty she had been carrying for weeks. He had not pretended coincidence, explained everything. He had simply told the truth. "I hope that does not upset you," he said. Her answer surprised both of them. Alessandro's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Then I am glad I chose honesty." The conversation drifted naturally toward books, neighborhood schools, and the challenges facing community libraries. For nearly 15 minutes, neither mentioned wealth, influence, nor business. Harper discovered he remembered novels he had read as a teenager. Alessandro learned she believed every child deserved one adult who encouraged curiosity without expecting perfection. When another customer approached the register, Harper apologized. "I should get back to work." "Of course," Alessandro replied. "Thank you for answering. Thank you for calling." Neither moved to end the call immediately. Both seemed reluctant to break the comfortable silence that had unexpectedly settled between them. Finally, Harper smiled. "Have a good afternoon, Alessandro." "You as well, Harper." The line disconnected, leaving only the quiet sounds of the bookstore around her. She slipped the phone back onto the counter, unaware that several blocks away Alessandro remained standing beside his office window with the faintest smile anyone there had seen in years. Unfortunately for both of them, the conversation that finally replaced mystery with honesty had also marked the moment when two very different worlds quietly began moving toward one another in ways neither could control. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm neither Harper nor Alessandro had expected. They did not speak every day, and somehow that made each conversation feel more genuine instead of less. Sometimes a brief phone call lasted only 5 minutes. Other evenings they exchanged recommendations for novels, discussed neighborhood schools, or laughed about the strange habits of bookstore customers and corporate executives. Their worlds remained remarkably different, yet every conversation uncovered another unexpected place where those worlds quietly overlapped. Harper still walked to work every morning beneath rows of turning maple trees, stopping at the same coffee shop where the owner already knew her order by heart. Alessandro still spent long hours inside conference rooms overlooking Chicago, making decisions that shaped companies, charities, and thousands of employees. Neither pretended their lives were becoming similar. They simply discovered that respect rarely depended on similarity. One Friday afternoon, Harper received an unexpected message from the Literacy Center asking whether she could attend a planning meeting for the expanded reading program. The anonymous funding had created opportunities no one had imagined possible only weeks earlier. More classrooms would open, more volunteers would be needed, entire neighborhoods would receive mobile libraries before winter arrived. Harper happily agreed. The meeting took place inside a restored public library whose stained glass windows scattered warm colors across polished wooden tables. Teachers, volunteers, librarians, and community organizers filled the room with hopeful conversations about children's futures. Halfway through the presentation, the program director welcomed another guest whose foundation had quietly supported the expansion from the beginning. Harper looked toward the entrance and found Alessandro standing beside the director, dressed simply in a navy suit without the large entourage she had expected. The room applauded politely. Alessandro thanked everyone for their work before stepping away from the podium almost immediately. "The real experts are already here," he said. "I only believe in giving them the resources they deserve." Harper noticed something else. He never once mentioned himself after that. Instead, he spent the next hour listening carefully, while teachers described overcrowded classrooms, and librarians explained how children often shared a single library card between siblings. When Harper suggested creating neighborhood reading nights where parents and children could read together after work, Alessandro did not interrupt or offer his own solution. He simply asked thoughtful questions and quietly wrote notes. By the end of the meeting, several volunteers approached Harper. "Does he always listen like that?" one librarian whispered. Harper smiled uncertainly. "I think he does." As everyone prepared to leave, the program director realized heavy rain had unexpectedly returned, pounding against the library windows with familiar determination. Guests gathered beneath the entrance canopy while waiting for rides. Harper stood beside Alessandro watching water race along the sidewalks exactly as it had on the night they first met. "Chicago certainly enjoys repeating itself," she said with a quiet laugh. Alessandro looked toward the storm before smiling. "Perhaps it is reminding us where every unexpected story begins." She laughed again, this time without hesitation. A volunteer hurried over carrying only one large umbrella. "I only have this one left," she apologized. "Would either of you mind sharing it to the parking lot? The garage is only across the street." Harper instinctively began declining before Alessandro spoke first, only if Miss Collins is comfortable with the arrangement. She looked toward the rain, then back at him. The memory of refusing his ride after the gala crossed her mind, followed by the honesty he had shown since. "I think walking across one street together is a reasonable risk," she answered with a smile. They stepped beneath the umbrella as cold rain drummed softly against the fabric overhead. Cars splashed through shallow puddles while city lights shimmered across wet pavement. Neither hurried. The short walk somehow felt longer than the distance itself. "Can I ask you something?" Harper finally said. "Anything. Why did you remember one stranger after all this time?" Alessandro remained quiet long enough for the sound of rain to fill the space between them. "Because everyone else protected their phone," he answered calmly. "You protected a person's dignity. There is a difference." Harper looked at him without speaking. He continued walking slowly beside her. "Most people saw inconvenience. You saw someone who needed 30 seconds. They reached the parking garage entrance just as the rain intensified again. Harper lowered the umbrella slightly and smiled with genuine warmth. "Then I suppose we were both fortunate that my battery still had 7%. Alessandro laughed softly, the sound almost lost beneath the storm. "It was more valuable than either of us realized." What Harper still did not know was that less than a block away, another pair of observant eyes quietly watched the two figures disappear into the garage together. And before the evening was over, a single anonymous message would arrive warning Alessandro that someone had finally begun asking questions about the woman whose simple kindness had unexpectedly become the most important part of his carefully ordered world. Harper slept surprisingly well after the walk through the rain, yet the quiet happiness she carried into the following week came with questions she could no longer ignore. Every conversation with Alessandro made him seem less like the distant executive the newspapers occasionally mentioned, and more like a thoughtful man who noticed details most people overlooked. Still, there were moments when the distance between their lives became impossible to ignore. She worked surrounded by paperbacks and handwritten recommendations taped beneath bookstore shelves. He moved between boardrooms, charitable foundations, and responsibilities that stretched far beyond anything she had ever imagined. Neither of them pretended those differences did not exist. Instead, they seemed to treat them with quiet respect. Tuesday afternoon brought another unexpected surprise. Harper arrived at the literacy center to discover volunteers unloading portable bookshelves into a brightly painted delivery truck. Children gathered outside cheering as librarians arranged hundreds of new books that would travel through neighborhoods where permanent libraries had closed years before. The project had become real. Families would no longer need to travel across the city simply to borrow a novel or help a child complete homework. Harper watched smiling parents thank volunteers while children carefully selected their first books. The joy around her felt almost impossible to measure. During the celebration, the program director quietly approached with a folded letter. "This arrived for you," she said. "It came with the first shipment this morning." Harper opened the envelope carefully. Inside rested a handwritten note on thick cream stationery. There was no company logo, only familiar handwriting. "I hope today reminds you that one person's compassion never ends where one moment ends. Sometimes it quietly continues through people who never even know your name. Thank you for starting something you never intended to start." Harper smiled before carefully folding the note back into the envelope. She did not need a signature to know who had written it. Across downtown Chicago, Alessandro concluded another meeting before receiving a brief report from his security chief. "The anonymous message from Friday has been traced as far as possible," the older man explained. "Nothing directly threatening. Only questions. Someone appears interested in learning why Miss Collins has recently appeared near Foundation events." Alessandro remained silent. "Continue observing only the situation," he replied, "not her. The distinction mattered. If the questions become more serious, tell me immediately." That evening, Harper decided to call Alessandro instead of waiting for him to reach out first. The moment he answered, she could hear city traffic somewhere beyond his office window. "I received your letter," she said warmly. "I thought you might. You really did not have to thank me again." Alessandro laughed softly. "At this point, I suspect we have both accepted that neither of us will win that particular argument." Harper found herself laughing with him. The conversation drifted toward the mobile library project, favorite childhood stories, and the teachers who had changed their lives. Eventually, Harper asked the question that had quietly lingered in her thoughts since the gala. Do you ever get tired of people expecting something from you? Silence settled for only a moment. More often than I admit, Alessandro answered honestly. That is why conversations like this matter. Because I do not expect anything, because you never have. His answer stayed with her long after the call ended. Later that week, Harper closed the bookstore just before sunset and began walking toward the elevated train station. Autumn had painted the city in deep shades of gold and crimson. Office workers filled the sidewalks while musicians performed outside cafes preparing for the evening rush. Everything appeared wonderfully ordinary until she noticed a photographer struggling with several heavy equipment cases near the entrance to a public park. Without hesitation, she set down her own bag and helped carry 2 cases across the uneven brick pathway. The grateful photographer thanked her repeatedly before rushing toward an outdoor charity event beginning only minutes later. Harper smiled, wished him luck, and continued toward the station without another thought. Less than 15 minutes later, Alessandro arrived at the same event as its principal donor. As organizers hurried to finalize preparations, the photographer apologized for arriving late before explaining that a stranger had stopped to help carry his equipment across the park. Alessandro listened politely until the man casually described a young woman with blonde hair, a navy coat, and an easy smile. Alessandro looked toward the crowded sidewalk outside the park gates, where thousands of strangers passed beneath glowing streetlights. By then, Harper had already disappeared into the evening crowd. He smiled almost to himself. Somehow, even when she was nowhere near him, she still found another person who needed help. Unfortunately for both of them, the same anonymous observer who had begun asking questions days earlier had also noticed a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. And for the first time, curiosity was quietly turning into intention. The anonymous questions that had quietly circled around Harper for days never reached her ears. Her life continued with comforting predictability. She opened the bookstore every morning, recommended novels to curious readers, volunteered whenever the literacy center needed another pair of hands, and called Alessandro whenever one of them discovered a story worth sharing. To her, the growing friendship still felt wonderfully uncomplicated. She believed it had been built on honesty, gratitude, and 2 people who happened to value the same things. She did not realize someone else had begun drawing very different conclusions. One chilly Thursday afternoon, Harper finished shelving a collection of classic American novels when an unfamiliar customer approached the register. The woman appeared pleasant, perhaps in her early 40s, dressed professionally and carrying a leather notebook beneath one arm. "You are Harper Collins, correct?" she asked politely. Harper smiled. "That is right. How can I help you? Actually, I hoped you could recommend a book for my nephew. He struggles with reading." Harper immediately stepped away from the register and spent nearly 20 minutes walking through the children's section, carefully explaining which stories encouraged reluctant readers without making them feel discouraged. The woman listened attentively, purchased 3 books, thanked Harper warmly, and quietly left the store. Harper never considered the encounter unusual. Less than an hour later, the same woman entered a downtown office building and handed a brief report to a man waiting inside a private conference room. "Everything appears exactly as described," she said. "She is genuine." Alessandro looked up with visible disappointment. "I asked for no investigation." "You did not," she admitted. "I simply wanted you to know before inaccurate conclusions reached you first." Alessandro closed the folder without reading beyond the first page. "There will be no more reports," he said calmly. "Miss Collins deserves to live without strangers measuring her character." The woman nodded respectfully before leaving the room. Alessandro remained standing beside the conference table for several long moments. The situation troubled him far more than he wished to admit. Harper had unknowingly become the subject of attention she had never asked for. He quietly instructed his assistant to cancel several evening appointments before placing a single phone call. Harper answered almost immediately. "Good evening," she said cheerfully. "I was just locking the bookstore. Would you allow me to buy you a cup of coffee?" Alessandro asked. "Nothing formal, no speeches, just coffee," she smiled to herself. "Only if I buy the pastries. I suspect negotiating with you will always end this way, probably." They agreed to meet at a small neighborhood cafe halfway between the bookstore and the literacy center, far removed from luxury hotels and corporate offices. The cafe occupied the corner of an old brick building where mismatched chairs, handwritten menus, and quiet jazz created the feeling that everyone belonged there. Harper arrived first, choosing a table beside the front window. Alessandro entered several minutes later wearing a dark wool coat instead of a tailored business jacket. Without assistants or security standing nearby, he looked remarkably similar to the man she had first met beneath the rain. They ordered coffee, shared warm apple pastries exactly as promised, and talked for nearly 2 hours. Harper spoke about growing up in a family that believed books could solve almost any problem. Alessandro described learning from his grandfather that respect was earned through consistency rather than influence. Neither conversation felt forced. The pauses between sentences became as comfortable as the words themselves. Eventually, Harper looked out the window where early snowflakes had begun drifting through the evening air. "Can I ask you something honestly?" she said. "Always. People seem nervous around you before they even know you. Why?" Alessandro studied the steam rising from his cob before. "Because family's business has been surrounded by stories for many years. Stories? Some true, some exaggerated, some completely invented." Harper met his eyes without looking away. "And which ones should I believe?" He smiled faintly. "Only the person sitting across from you." The answer lingered between them long after neither spoke another word. When they finally stepped outside, the first light snowfall of the season covered the sidewalks in a thin white layer. Harper laughed quietly as flakes settled on her coat sleeves. Alessandro looked upward for a brief moment before saying, "Chicago always knows when a chapter is changing." She smiled. "Then I hope the next one is worth reading." Neither of them noticed a parked vehicle several buildings away where someone quietly lowered a camera without taking a single photograph. Whoever had been watching no longer needed proof. They had already seen enough to understand that what began with 30 borrowed seconds had quietly become something neither money nor influence had ever been able to create. The first snowfall of the season transformed Chicago overnight. Rooftops disappeared beneath soft white blankets, tree branches shimmered beneath morning light, and familiar streets seemed quieter than they had only a day before. Harper paused outside the bookstore before unlocking the front door, watching children leave footprints across the untouched sidewalk, while parents hurried after them carrying steaming cups of coffee. Winter always slowed the city just enough to remind people to notice one another. Inside, the warmth of old wooden shelves and fresh coffee welcomed the first customers of the morning. Business remained steady, but Harper found herself smiling more often than usual. The conversations she had shared with Alessandro no longer felt like remarkable exceptions. They had quietly become part of her routine. She still thought of him as someone from an entirely different world, yet every time they spoke, that distance seemed just a little smaller. Around noon, her phone vibrated with a message. It contained only one sentence. "The first snow deserves the first walk. If you are free after work, I know a place where the city becomes quiet." Harper smiled before typing a simple reply. "I finish at 6. Less than an hour later, Alessandro closed a meeting earlier than anyone expected. His assistant noticed the unusual change immediately. "Everything has been moved to tomorrow," she confirmed. "Thank you," he answered before adding one more instruction. "No one needs to accompany me this evening." The assistant hesitated. "Are you certain?" Alessandro looked toward the snow drifting beyond the office windows. "Completely." By early evening, the snowfall had slowed to a gentle whisper. Harper found Alessandro waiting outside the bookstore wearing the same dark wool coat she had seen at the neighborhood cafe. No motorcade waited nearby. No formal security presence surrounded him. Only a quiet smile appeared as she approached. "You found the place?" she asked playfully. "Eventually," he replied. "Your bookstore has a way of hiding behind good stories." They walked several blocks toward the Chicago River, where a pedestrian path overlooked the water flowing beneath bridges decorated with winter lights. Couples wandered slowly between glowing trees, while musicians played soft holiday melodies farther down the promenade. The city felt strangely peaceful. They spoke about childhood winters, favorite family traditions, and the books that had shaped their earliest dreams. Harper admitted she still reread the same novel every December because it reminded her of evenings spent reading beside her mother. Alessandro confessed that his grandfather had once insisted every meaningful decision should be made only after taking a long walk outdoors. He believed cold air helped people separate pride from truth, Alessandro said. Harper laughed quietly. "Did it work?" "More often than I wanted." They continued walking until they reached a small overlook where snow settled gently across empty benches facing the river. Neither hurried to fill the silence. The quiet itself had become comfortable. After several moments, Harper turned toward him. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course. When I first saw those black vehicles during the storm, I assumed you were someone impossible to understand." Alessandro smiled faintly. Many people still think that. I was wrong. He studied her expression carefully. Why? Harper looked across the water before answering. Because every important thing I have learned about you came from small moments instead of big ones. The way you listened to teachers. The way you remembered volunteers. The way you accepted no for an answer outside the hotel. The way you thanked people who could never repay you. Alessandro remained silent. She continued softly. People reveal themselves through habits, not headlines. The words settled between them more heavily than either expected. Alessandro finally looked toward the snow-covered river. You may be the first person who has ever judged me that way. Maybe everyone deserves to be known before they are judged. At that exact moment, less than a mile away, the anonymous questions that had quietly followed Harper for weeks finally reached their conclusion. Alessandro's security chief entered his office carrying a sealed envelope that had arrived without a return address. Inside was a single typed page. We know who she is, also she matters to you. The older man immediately called Alessandro. His phone vibrated inside his coat pocket as he stood beside Harper beneath the falling snow. Alessandro glanced at the screen but did not answer. Instead, he silenced the call and returned the phone to his pocket. Harper noticed the movement. Everything all right? She asked. Alessandro met her eyes and answered with complete honesty. It can wait. She smiled, unaware of the significance behind those 3 words. Unfortunately for both of them, the message waiting inside that unanswered phone call would become impossible to postpone once the quiet beauty of that winter evening came to an end. The phone call Alessandro had ignored followed him home long after the snow had melted from his coat. Shortly after returning to his office, he listened quietly as his security chief placed the anonymous letter on the desk between them. There were no threats, no demands, only a single unsettling sentence that confirmed someone had connected Harper Collins to him. Alessandro read the page once before folding it neatly and sliding it back into the envelope. Has anyone approached her directly? He asked. No, the older man answered. Only quiet observation, nothing more. Alessandro nodded. Then it ends here. How? By making certain there is nothing left worth observing. The following morning, every unnecessary report connected to Harper was permanently deleted. Instructions were issued that no one associated with Alessandro's companies, foundations, or security operations would gather information about her again unless her immediate safety required it. He refused to allow the kindness that had brought them together to become a burden she never chose. Meanwhile, Harper began her Saturday exactly as she always did. She opened the bookstore, recommended holiday gifts to hurried shoppers, wrapped children's books in bright paper, and laughed with regular customers who debated which classic novel deserved to be read every winter. Life still felt beautifully ordinary, and she hoped it would remain that way. Late that afternoon, her phone rang. Alessandro's voice sounded calmer than usual, but she sensed something thoughtful beneath the surface. Would you have time for one more walk? He asked. I always seem to think more clearly when we are outside. Harper smiled. Only if there is hot chocolate afterward. That sounds like a fair negotiation. They met at Lincoln Park just before sunset. Fresh snow still rested beneath bare trees while the last golden light reflected across the frozen ponds. Families built snowmen. Children laughed as sleds slid gently down nearby hills. The city somehow felt both enormous and intimate at the same time. They walked without rushing, their footsteps leaving 2 parallel lines across untouched snow. Eventually, Alessandro stopped beside a quiet overlook where the skyline stretched across the horizon. There is something I need to tell you, he said. Harper waited patiently. For most of my life, he continued, people approached me because they wanted access. Opportunity, influence, or protection. I accepted that as part of my world. Then, one rainy night, someone handed me a phone without asking my name, my title, or what I could offer in return. Harper looked down at the snow before smiling softly. I only saw someone who needed help. Exactly. Alessandro met her eyes. You reminded me that trust can still exist without negotiation, that kindness can still exist without calculation. You changed something I did not realize needed changing. Harper stood quietly for several seconds, letting his words settle naturally instead of rushing to answer them. Finally, she spoke. Can I tell you what changed for me? Alessandro nodded. When I first met you, I assumed influence made people distant. Then I watched you listen to teachers longer than executives. I watched you remember volunteers by name. I watched you accept honesty even when it was uncomfortable. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing the stories people told about you and started seeing the person standing in front of me. The winter air carried their words away across the frozen park. Neither needed to say anything more for a while. Sometimes silence completed conversations better than language ever could. Alessandro reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed the silver bookmark he had commissioned months earlier. Harper smiled. "I already have one." "I know," he replied. "This one belongs to me." For the first time, it carried the same simple sentence as hers. "Kindness travels farther than we ever see." "I kept it as a reminder," Alessandro said quietly. "Because every important chapter in my life began the night someone trusted a stranger in the rain." Harper laughed gently through eyes beginning to glisten. "Then I suppose we have both been carrying the same bookmark through different stories." He smiled. Perhaps they have become the same story. As evening settled over Chicago, neither of them noticed that the anonymous questions had quietly disappeared as completely as they had first appeared. With nothing left to discover, no misunderstandings remaining, and no secrets still dividing their worlds, curiosity had finally surrendered to truth. The only thing waiting ahead was whatever future two honest people might choose to write together. One ordinary act of kindness at a time, spring arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, replacing snow-covered sidewalks with rows of blooming trees that stretched along Chicago's neighborhoods like fresh promises after a long winter. The Literacy Center welcomed twice as many children as it had only a few months earlier. Mobile libraries visited schools every week. Volunteers filled classrooms with stories, laughter, and patient encouragement. HarperCollins still opened the bookstore every morning with the same familiar routine, greeting regular customers by name and recommending novels with the same genuine enthusiasm she had always carried. Success had not changed her because kindness had never depended on circumstances. It had always been who she was. Alessandro Romano continued leading his companies and charitable foundations with the same quiet discipline that defined every decision he made. Yet those closest to him noticed something they had never witnessed before. Meetings ended earlier when community events required his presence. Educational programs received even greater attention than before. Conversations about quarterly numbers increasingly ended with questions about schools, libraries, and neighborhood partnerships. Influence had not disappeared from his life. It had simply found a more meaningful direction. One bright Saturday afternoon, the Literacy Center celebrated the opening of its newest reading garden, an outdoor space filled with benches, flowering trees, and shelves protected beneath elegant glass canopies where children could read during warm afternoons. Families gathered carrying picnic blankets while teachers organized storytelling circles across the lawn. Harper moved through the crowd, helping children choose books, laughing as excited readers raced toward colorful cushions scattered beneath the trees. Alessandro arrived quietly without announcements or formal introductions. Many guests recognized him, but he politely redirected every compliment toward the volunteers who had spent months transforming an empty courtyard into a place filled with imagination. Watching him greet librarians before executives and teachers before donors, Harper realized that the man standing beside her no longer resembled the distant figure she had first imagined beneath the storm. He had always possessed generosity. She had simply been the first person to remind him where it truly belonged. As the afternoon drew toward its conclusion, the program director invited everyone to gather near the entrance for a dedication plaque recognizing the countless volunteers and supporters whose combined efforts had built the reading garden. There were no individual names carved into polished stone. Instead, one simple sentence appeared beneath the foundation emblem. "Every great story begins with one act of kindness." The crowd applauded warmly. Harper felt her eyes drift toward Alessandro, who quietly smiled before looking back at the children already filling every bench with open books. Neither of them needed public recognition. The garden itself was enough. Later that evening, they walked together through the neighborhood where everything had begun months before. The old bakery still stood on the corner. The bookstore windows glowed warmly behind them. The familiar bus stop remained exactly where it had always been, its weathered bench unchanged despite the passing seasons. Harper stopped beside the shelter and laughed softly. "It still looks exactly the same." Alessandro glanced toward the street where gentle rain had begun falling once again. Some places never realize they changed someone's life. She looked at the darkening sky before smiling. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if my phone had died that night?" Alessandro shook his head. "No, why not?" "Because I think kindness always finds another way. Rain tapped gently against the metal roof above them, echoing the memory of the evening that had brought two strangers together without either of them understanding why. Harper reached into her bag and removed the silver bookmark she still carried every day inside the novel she was currently reading. Alessandro quietly took his own matching bookmark from his coat pocket. They laughed as the identical pieces of silver reflected the nearby streetlights. "We really did end up carrying the same story," Harper said. "We did," Alessandro answered. "Only now we get to keep writing it together." Neither promise sounded dramatic. Neither needed to. Some futures announced themselves through grand declarations. Others arrived as quietly as spring after winter. A city bus rolled past without stopping because neither of them was waiting for one anymore. They remained beneath the shelter for another peaceful moment, listening to the rain, watching strangers hurry through the evening exactly as they once had. Somewhere nearby, another traveler searched for directions. Somewhere else, another stranger wondered whether asking for help was worth the risk. Harper smiled, stepped away from the shelter, and offered her umbrella to an elderly woman struggling with grocery bags before continuing into the rain beside Alessandro. He watched the familiar gesture with quiet admiration, no longer surprised because he finally understood that kindness was not something Harper occasionally chose. It was simply the way she moved through the world. Together they disappeared beneath the softly falling rain while the old bus stop stood silently behind them, waiting for another ordinary evening, another passing stranger, and perhaps the beginning of another story that nobody could possibly predict.